The ice in my glass had long since melted, leaving only the amber remains of what used to be whiskey. I stared at it, watching the liquid catch the dim light from the neon beer sign behind the bar, the only real illumination left in this place that felt suspended somewhere between midnight and morning. Most of the stools sat empty now, their red vinyl surfaces still warm from bodies that had wandered home hours ago, back to beds and responsibilities and lives that made sense. I should have left with them. Should have walked out into the parking lot, started my car, and driven the familiar route through sleeping neighborhoods to the house, where Evelyn would be curled beneath our comforter, one hand stretched across the space where I belonged. The kitchen light would still be on. She always left it on when I worked late. A small beacon of domesticity waiting to guide me back to the life I had built with such careful precision. Instead, I remained rooted to this bar stool, my wedding ring tapping against the glass with each small movement of my hand. The sound echoed in the quiet space, a tiny percussion of guilt that I couldn't seem to stop making. Malcolm moved behind the bar with the same unhurried grace he carried in the office, though here, in his own establishment, something about him felt different, less constrained. The sleeves of his white shirt were rolled to his elbows, and without his jacket, I could see the way his shoulders moved as he reached for bottles, wiped down surfaces, performed the closing rituals of a man who owned this sanctuary at the edge of town. His inheritance, he had mentioned once, something left behind by a brother whose story he never finished telling. He approached with the bottle in his hand, not asking if I wanted another, simply knowing. The pour was generous, deliberate, and when he set the glass before me, his fingers lingered on its base longer than necessary. I found myself studying those fingers, clean, capable, wearing no rings at all. I reached for my wallet instinctively, the motion automatic after 42 years of paying for what I consumed, of settling debts and maintaining the careful balance of transactions that kept my world orderly. But before I could extract my credit card, Malcolm's hand covered mine. Not grabbing, not urgent, just there, present and warm and impossibly steady against the trembling I hadn't realized had started. The touch lasted only seconds, but those seconds stretched into something vast and terrifying. His palm against my knuckles, his thumb brushing the edge of my wedding band. The weight of his attention focused entirely on this moment that felt both infinite and fragile. I looked up to find him watching me with an expression I couldn't name, something between recognition and question, as if he were seeing something in me that I had spent a lifetime hiding. The bar around us seemed to hold its breath. The refrigerator hummed. The neon sign flickered once, casting brief shadows across the bottles lined up like soldiers along the mirrored wall. Somewhere in the distance, a car passed on the highway, its headlights sweeping across the windows before disappearing into the night that waited for everyone except us. I thought of home again, not just the kitchen light, but the grandfather clock in the hallway that marked time with such certainty, the photographs lining the stairwell that documented a life lived according to plan, the bed where Evelyn slept beside the space that belonged to me. I thought of my children, safe in their rooms, dreaming whatever dreams came to those who had never questioned the shape of their desires. And yet I could not move my hand from beneath Malcolm's, could not break whatever spell had settled over this dim corner of the world where two men sat surrounded by empty glasses and unspoken truths. The bar had become a threshold I was not ready to cross, and the night stretched ahead of us like a question I was finally ready to hear. The drive home from Malcolm's bar took me through neighborhoods I had memorized over 18 years of marriage. Past the Hendersons' house with its perpetually perfect lawn, past the corner where Sarah Chun waited for the school bus each morning with her violin case, past the small park where I had taught both my children to ride bicycles on separate summer afternoons that now felt like scenes from someone else's life. Our house sat at the end of Maple Street, a colonial revival with sage green shutters that Evelyn had chosen because they reminded her of her grandmother's cottage in Vermont. The driveway curved just slightly, lined with the boxwood hedges we had planted the year after Michael was born. Every spring, I trimmed them with electric shears, maintaining the precise edges that made our property look like something from a magazine devoted to suburban achievement. Inside, the photographs told the story we had agreed to live. Michael's graduation from 8th grade, his braces gleaming in the gymnasium light. Emma's soccer trophy presentation, her ponytail captured mid-bounce as she reached for the golden cup. Family vacations to Cape Cod, where we rented the same cottage each July and took the same photograph on the beach. Our children growing taller in increments, our faces aging in ways that seemed gradual until I studied them closely in the hallway mirror. Evelyn moved through our home with the grace of someone who had found her place in the world. She organized the spice rack alphabetically, knew which grocery store had the best prices on organic produce, and maintained a calendar on the refrigerator that tracked our lives in color-coded precision. Blue for Michael's band practice, green for Emma's soccer games, red for the dinner parties we hosted every few months where neighbors gathered in our dining room to discuss property taxes and school board elections. I had learned to play my role in this choreography. I mowed the lawn on Saturday mornings, attended parent-teacher conferences with questions prepared in advance, and participated in conversations about college savings plans with the appropriate level of concern and forward-thinking responsibility. At neighborhood barbecues, I stood near the grill with other fathers, discussing mortgage rates and the merits of different lawn fertilizers, my beer growing warm in my hand as I nodded at the right moments and offered opinions I had borrowed from articles I barely remembered reading. But in the quiet spaces between these performances, something else lived. Late at night, after Evelyn had fallen asleep and the house settled into its familiar creaks and sighs, I would find myself standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the street I knew so well it had become invisible. The grandfather clock in the hallway marked time with mechanical certainty, its brass pendulum catching the moonlight that filtered through the front hall window. Tick, 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 the sound of a life measured in predictable increments. During my morning shave, I would catch my own eyes in the bathroom mirror and feel the weight of questions I had never allowed myself to ask. The face looking back at me was respectable, reliable, the face of a man who had built something solid and permanent. But beneath that surface, in the spaces between one breath and the next, I glimpsed something else entirely, a restlessness that had no name and no acceptable outlet. Work provided its own rhythm of concealment. The regional office where I spent my days sat in a glass building downtown, surrounded by parking meters and coffee shops that served the professionals who moved through the city's commercial district like schools of fish, purposeful and anonymous. I occupied a middle management position that required me to attend meetings, review reports, and maintain the delicate balance between the expectations of those above me and the needs of those I supervised. Malcolm's corner office overlooked the street, separated from the main floor by glass walls that suggested transparency while maintaining the privacy that authority required. He had worked for the company longer than anyone could remember, arriving each morning precisely at 7:30. Leaving each evening after everyone else had gone home. His personal life remained a mystery that spawned speculation in the break room. Theories about why he had never married, why he lived alone in the apartment above his bar, why he sometimes seemed to be listening to conversations no one else could hear. In meetings, he possessed a stillness that commanded attention, while others filled silence with unnecessary words. Malcolm spoke only when his contributions carried weight. He had a way of looking directly at whoever was speaking, as if their thoughts deserved his complete attention, and when he offered feedback, it came with a precision that cut through confusion and reached the heart of whatever problem we were trying to solve. I found myself studying him during those corporate gatherings, noting the way his fingers moved when he took notes, the angle of his head when he listened, the rare moments when something approaching amusement flickered across his features. He wore his authority quietly, without the performative displays of power that characterized so many men in similar positions. There was something almost monastic about his presence, as if he had made peace with solitude in ways that eluded the rest of us. Our professional interactions remained courteous and efficient, bounded by the protocols that governed workplace relationships. He approved my reports, I implemented his suggestions, and we maintained the careful distance that allowed the machinery of business to function smoothly. But sometimes, when he handed me documents or we found ourselves alone in the elevator, I would catch something in his expression that felt like recognition, as if he could see through the careful construction of my professional persona to something more essential underneath. The bar he owned existed in a different universe from the fluorescent-lit world of our office. I had driven past it countless times over the years, a low building with brick walls and small windows that revealed little of what lay inside. The parking lot was gravel, lined with cars that looked lived in rather than pristine, and the sign that bore the establishment's name had weathered to a comfortable illegibility that somehow seemed intentional. I had never imagined myself as the kind of man who would linger in such a place, nursing drinks while the night deepened around me. My social life existed within the boundaries of dinner parties and neighborhood gatherings, events that ended at reasonable hours and sent everyone home to their respective beds and morning routines. But that night, after the others had drifted away, I had discovered something in Malcolm's bar that I could not find in any other corner of my carefully constructed world. It was the possibility of conversation that meant something. The chance to sit in the presence of someone who seemed to understand that beneath our daily performances, we were all carrying questions too dangerous to speak aloud. And in the amber light of that quiet space, with Malcolm moving behind the bar like a man who had found his place in the world, I had felt something I had forgotten I was capable of feeling. I had felt known. The invitation arrived on a Thursday afternoon, delivered with the same understated precision that characterized everything Malcolm did. We had just finished the quarterly presentation that had consumed our department for weeks, charts and projections that would determine budget allocations for the coming year. The conference room still held the lingering tension of executives asking pointed questions about market penetration and cost efficiency, but we had survived with our projections intact. Malcolm appeared at my cubicle as I was organizing the files that had accumulated during the preparation marathon. His approach was quiet, unhurried, and when he spoke, his voice carried the same professional tone he used in meetings. The team was gathering at his bar that evening, he said. Nothing formal, just a chance to decompress after the deadline that had kept us all working past midnight for the better part of a month. I should join them if I felt inclined. The phrasing was careful, neutral, offering an escape route disguised as casual invitation. I could have declined with any number of reasonable excuses: family dinner, household responsibilities, the simple fatigue that came from weeks of sustained pressure. Instead, I heard myself accepting before I had consciously made the decision. That evening, I called Evelyn to explain I would be late. A work gathering, I told her, the kind of obligatory socializing that came with middle management. She responded with the practiced understanding of someone who had learned to navigate the demands of corporate life alongside her own responsibilities. Dinner would be kept warm, she said. Drive safely. Malcolm's bar revealed itself differently in the early evening, populated by the colleagues I knew from fluorescent-lit meetings and shared deadlines. The atmosphere felt almost festive, relief mixed with accomplishment, the particular joy that comes from surviving something difficult as a group. Conversations flowed around shared war stories from the presentation preparation, jokes about the executives who had grilled us, speculations about whether our hard work would translate into the resources we needed. I nursed a beer and participated in the familiar ritual of workplace bonding, but part of my attention remained fixed on Malcolm. Behind his own bar, he moved with an easy authority that felt different from his corporate presence. He poured drinks with the unconscious skill of someone who had performed these motions thousands of times, engaging in conversations that ranged from sports to politics to the minor gossip that binds any group of people who spend their days in proximity. As the evening progressed, my colleagues began the gradual exodus that marked the end of such gatherings. One by one, they collected their jackets and made their excuses: babysitters to relieve, early meetings to prepare for, the simple desire to return home to whatever comforts awaited them there. I watched them leave with a growing awareness that I should follow their example, that the responsible choice was to settle my tab and drive the familiar route back to Maple Street. But when the last of our co-workers had disappeared into the parking lot, leaving only empty glasses and the faint residue of conversations, I remained. Malcolm, rather than suggesting it was time for me to leave, approached with a bottle and refreshed my glass without asking if I wanted another drink. The gesture felt like an invitation to a different kind of evening, one that existed outside the boundaries of professional obligation. We were alone now in a way that felt both natural and charged with possibility. The bar had transformed again, becoming the intimate space I remembered from that first late-night encounter. Malcolm moved behind the counter with the same unhurried grace, but his attention had shifted, focusing on something that felt more personal than the group dynamics that had characterized the earlier part of the evening. He began to speak in a way I had never heard before, not the measured corporate communication that defined our workplace interactions, but something more unguarded. Stories emerged about his past, fragments of a life lived largely in private. He had grown up in a smaller town, he told me, where expectations were carved in stone and deviation from established patterns carried consequences that echoed through generations. There had been a teacher in high school, he said, who had encouraged his interest in literature when such encouragement was rare. A professor in college who had seen potential in ideas that others dismissed. Men whose influence had shaped him in ways that remained difficult to articulate. Relationships that existed in the spaces between mentorship and something deeper that could never be named directly. He never looked at me directly during these revelations, his gaze fixed on the bottles lined behind the bar or the surface he polished with automatic precision. But his words carried a weight that seemed intended specifically for me, as if he were sharing secrets that had been waiting years for the right listener. I found myself leaning forward, drawn into stories that felt both foreign and familiar, recognizing something in his carefully chosen phrases that resonated with experiences I had never allowed myself to examine closely. The most profound moment came when he paused in his storytelling and looked directly into the mirror behind the bar, our eyes meeting in the reflection rather than face to face. He spoke about the way people live two lives, he said, the one they perform for the world and the one they carry in secret. Most people, he continued, spend so much energy maintaining the performance that they forget the other life exists at all. They become so skilled at pretending that the pretense becomes their reality, until the buried life withers from neglect. As he spoke these words, I felt something shift inside my chest, a recognition so profound it was almost painful. For the first time in my adult life, I was listening to someone who seemed to understand the weight I carried, the careful construction of respectability that had defined my existence, the exhausting effort required to maintain a persona that fit the expectations of family and community and professional advancement. When Malcolm finally turned from the mirror to face me directly, his expression held none of the careful neutrality that characterized our office interactions. Instead, I saw something that looked like understanding, tinged with a sadness that suggested he recognized the cost of the revelations he was sharing. The space between us seemed to vibrate with unspoken questions and possibilities that had been hovering at the edges of my consciousness for longer than I cared to admit. The bar had become a confessional, and Malcolm had offered me absolution for sins I had never been able to name. But more than that, he had suggested that the life I had buried might still be worthy of resurrection, that the truth I had spent decades avoiding might be the key to a kind of authenticity I had forgotten was possible. When he placed his hand over mine that night, it felt less like seduction than recognition, the acknowledgement that we had both been carrying the same secret weight, that we had found each other across the careful distance that separates those who live according to expectation from those brave enough to pursue something real. The days that followed that evening at Malcolm's bar stretched before me like a landscape I no longer recognized. Everything appeared exactly as it had before. The same morning routine of shower and coffee and carefully knotted tie, the same drive through familiar neighborhoods, the same elevator ride to the fluorescent-lit world of spreadsheets and quarterly reports. But underneath the surface of this ordinary life, something fundamental had shifted, like a fault line that had moved imperceptibly in the night, leaving everything standing but fundamentally altered. At work, I found myself hyper-aware of Malcolm's presence in ways that felt both thrilling and dangerous. Our professional interactions continued with their customary efficiency, but now every exchange carried an undercurrent of memory from that night, when he had spoken about the two lives people carry. When he handed me documents, I noticed the way his fingers moved, the slight roughness of his skin where it brushed against mine. When he spoke during meetings, I found myself studying the shape of his mouth, the way he paused before delivering particularly important points, the rare moments when something approaching amusement flickered behind his careful professional mask. The office had become a theater where we performed the roles of supervisor and employee, but beneath that performance, I felt the weight of recognition growing between us. Our conversations began to extend beyond the necessary boundaries of work, lingering over details that could have been resolved in half the time. He would stop by my desk to discuss projects that didn't require face-to-face consultation, and I would find reasons to visit his office that went beyond the strict requirements of my position. These interactions felt like a delicate dance, each of us testing the boundaries of what could be acknowledged without crossing lines that couldn't be uncrossed. When he invited me to join him for lunch, ostensibly to discuss the upcoming budget review, I accepted with an eagerness that I tried to disguise as professional diligence. We chose restaurants away from the office, places where we were unlikely to encounter other colleagues, and our conversations gradually expanded beyond work to include books, music, and the kinds of philosophical observations that revealed more about who we were beneath our corporate personas. I discovered that Malcolm read poetry, not the safe, canonical works that educated people referenced to demonstrate their cultivation, but contemporary voices who wrote about longing and loss with a rawness that made my chest ache. He recommended authors whose names I had never heard, writers who explored the territory between desire and fulfillment with a precision that seemed to illuminate corners of my own experience I had never been able to articulate. During one lunch, he mentioned a concert he had attended the previous weekend, a jazz pianist whose interpretation of standards revealed new depths in familiar melodies. As he described the performance, his usual reserve melted away, and I caught glimpses of the passion he kept carefully contained during office hours. His enthusiasm was infectious, and I found myself promising to attend the next performance, though I had never shown particular interest in jazz before that moment. These extended lunches became a regular occurrence, then evolved into evening meetings at his bar after the workday ended. The transition felt natural, inevitable, as if we were both acknowledging that our connection required more space than daylight hours could provide. In the intimate atmosphere of the bar, with its amber lighting and the comfortable distance from our professional obligations, our conversations deepened in ways that both exhilarated and terrified me. We talked about regrets, the paths not taken, the compromises that had shaped our adult lives, the moments when we had chosen safety over authenticity. Malcolm spoke about opportunities he had declined, relationships he had avoided, the gradual process of learning to live within boundaries that felt both protective and confining. I found myself sharing doubts I had never voiced before, admitting to dissatisfactions I had barely acknowledged to myself. The most profound conversations came when we discussed the nature of happiness, whether it was something to be pursued or something that emerged naturally when we stopped fighting against our essential natures. Malcolm had a way of asking questions that seemed simple but revealed unexpected depths when I tried to answer them honestly. What did I want from life that I wasn't allowing myself to have? When was the last time I had felt truly alive? What would change if I stopped living according to other people's expectations? These questions followed me home each night, creating a restlessness that made my familiar routines feel like elaborate costumes I was wearing for a performance that no longer held my interest. I would sit at the dinner table, listening to Evelyn discuss her day, the parent-teacher conference she had attended for Emma, the book club meeting where they had debated the merits of the latest literary bestseller, the weekend plans that involved soccer games and grocery shopping, and all the pleasant obligations of suburban family life. Her words washed over me like background music, pleasant but somehow irrelevant to the internal storm that had been building since that first night when Malcolm's hand had covered mine. I found myself studying her across the table, noting the way she moved through our shared space with such comfortable familiarity and wondering what truths she might be carrying that I had never bothered to explore. Did she ever lie awake questioning the choices that had brought her to this precise configuration of house and husband and children? Did she ever feel the weight of a life unlived pressing against the boundaries of the life she had chosen? The distance between us became impossible to ignore. When she reached for my hand during our evening walk through the neighborhood, a routine we had maintained for years, her touch felt foreign, weighted with expectations I could no longer meet with authentic enthusiasm. When she suggested weekend activities that had once felt pleasant and undemanding, I found myself making excuses, claiming work obligations that were becoming increasingly elaborate and difficult to sustain. Our conversations began to develop an undercurrent of tension that neither of us acknowledged directly. She would mention my distraction, the way I seemed to be listening to something she couldn't hear. I would deflect with reassurances that felt hollow even as I spoke them, claiming fatigue from work pressures that were no more demanding than they had been for years. The arguments, when they came, were about surface things: money, scheduling, the logistics of managing a household and raising children. But underneath these practical disagreements, I could sense her growing awareness that something fundamental had shifted. She was too intelligent and too attuned to the rhythms of our marriage to miss the signs that I was becoming someone she didn't recognize. One evening, as I lay beside her in the bed we had shared for 18 years, listening to her breathing settle into the steady rhythm of sleep, I felt the full weight of what was happening to me. The space between us seemed vast, unbridgeable, even though I could reach out and touch her shoulder with minimal effort. I was disappearing from my own life, becoming a stranger in the house I had helped to build, playing a role that no longer fit the person I was becoming. But when I thought about Malcolm, the way his eyes lit up when he talked about something that genuinely interested him, the careful attention he paid when I spoke, the sense of recognition that passed between us in moments of unguarded conversation, I felt more alive than I had in years. The smallest gestures had taken on enormous significance. The way he said my name, with a slight emphasis that suggested it meant something more than mere identification. The brush of his fingers when he handed me papers, contact that lasted a fraction of a second longer than necessity required. The way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention, as if he were seeing something in me that I was only beginning to understand about myself. The office had become a stage where we performed restraint, maintaining the professional distance that our positions required while navigating the growing intensity of what was building between us. Every meeting felt charged with unspoken possibilities. Every casual interaction weighted with significance that had nothing to do with quarterly reports or budget projections. His bar had become something else entirely, a sanctuary where we could explore the connection that was transforming both of us. In that space, away from the fluorescent lights and glass walls of our professional world, we were free to be something closer to our authentic selves. The conversations that unfolded there felt like the most important discussions of my adult life, explorations of territory I had never allowed myself to enter. I was falling in love, though I couldn't yet admit it to myself in such direct terms. What I could acknowledge was that Malcolm had awakened something in me that had been dormant for so long I had forgotten it existed. In his presence, I felt the possibility of becoming someone I had never dared to be. Someone who lived according to his own truth rather than the expectations others had constructed around him. The transformation was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, a fundamental alteration of everything I thought I knew about myself and what I wanted from the years that remained to me. The night it happened, I had consumed more whiskey than wisdom would have recommended. Malcolm and I sat across from each other at the small table near the back of his bar, the same table we had claimed for our conversations over the past several weeks. The space between us felt charged with everything we had been circling around, all the careful words and loaded silences that had been building toward this moment without either of us acknowledging the inevitable destination. We had been talking about time, how it moved differently in different spaces, how the same hour could feel like minutes in one context and years in another. Malcolm had mentioned a theory he had read about parallel lives, the idea that we exist simultaneously in multiple versions of ourselves, each one shaped by different choices and circumstances. In some other universe, he suggested, we might be different people entirely, free to pursue connections that felt impossible in this reality. The conversation had started as philosophical speculation, the kind of abstract discussion that allowed us to explore dangerous territory under the cover of intellectual curiosity. But as the evening progressed and the whiskey softened the edges of our usual restraint, the theoretical became intensely personal. We were no longer talking about parallel universes or alternate selves. We were talking about us, about the life that existed in the spaces between our official identities. I found myself describing the weight I had been carrying for longer than I could measure, the sense of living inside a costume that had grown too small, of performing a role that demanded the suppression of everything that felt most essentially true about who I was. The words emerged haltingly at first, then with increasing urgency, as if a dam had finally burst after years of containing pressure I hadn't fully understood. I told him about the mornings when I looked in the mirror and felt like I was preparing for a masquerade, carefully constructing the appearance of a man who existed primarily in other people's expectations. I described the loneliness that came from being surrounded by family and colleagues while feeling fundamentally disconnected from all of them, as if I were watching my own life through glass that no one else could see. Malcolm listened with the stillness that had always characterized his most profound moments of attention, his eyes never leaving my face as I stumbled through revelations that had never been spoken aloud. When I paused, struggling to find language for experiences that seemed to exist beyond the boundaries of acceptable conversation, he didn't fill the silence with reassurances or attempts to redirect the discussion towards safer territory. He simply waited, creating space for whatever truth was trying to emerge. The breaking point came when I tried to explain what it felt like to be in his presence, how our conversations had awakened something in me that I had been afraid to acknowledge, how the person I became when we were together felt more real than any version of myself I had inhabited in years. I told him that I had built my entire adult life around walls I could no longer live behind, that the architecture of respectability I had constructed was suffocating the person I might have been if I had possessed the courage to choose authenticity over safety. As the words poured out of me, I felt simultaneously shattered and liberated, as if I were dismantling the careful structure of my existence one admission at a time. For the first time in my adult life, I was speaking without calculating the consequences, without considering how my revelations might be received or what they might cost me in terms of the relationships and security I had spent decades building. When I finally fell silent, the bar around us seemed to hold its breath. The refrigerator hummed. A car passed on the highway outside. The neon sign flickered once, casting brief shadows across Malcolm's face. He studied me with an expression I couldn't read, as if he were seeing something that had always been there, but had finally become visible. Then, without a word, he reached across the table and took my hand fully, without hesitation or the careful restraint that had characterized all our previous contact. His fingers interlaced with mine, and the simple gesture felt like recognition, not just of what I had confessed, but of something deeper that had been waiting for acknowledgement. The kiss that followed was inevitable and impossible, hesitant yet filled with a lifetime of unspoken truth. It lasted only seconds, but those seconds contained everything. All the conversations we had shared, all the careful glances across office conference rooms, all the nights when we had circled around this moment without daring to name what was drawing us together. When we separated, I felt both completely whole and utterly destroyed. Every assumption I had made about myself, every carefully constructed boundary that had defined my adult life, had been rendered irrelevant by that single gesture of connection. For the first time since adolescence, I was confronting the truth that I had always longed for this recognition, this intimacy, this sense of being seen and accepted by someone who understood the cost of authentic living. The revelation was followed by silence that felt vast and terrifying. We sat across from each other, my hand still in his, both of us aware that something irreversible had occurred. The life I had built, the identity I had maintained, the future I had imagined, all of it had been rendered provisional by what had just passed between us. Malcolm's expression mixed tenderness with something that looked like sorrow, as if he understood better than I did what this moment would cost both of us. He had lived longer with the knowledge of who he was, had made his peace with the solitude that came from choosing truth over conventional acceptance. But for me, this was the first glimpse of a landscape I had never allowed myself to explore, and the territory ahead felt both promising and perilous. When I finally stood to leave, my legs felt unsteady beneath me, as if I were learning to walk in a body that no longer fit the person I had been when I entered the bar hours earlier. Malcolm rose with me, and for a moment we stood facing each other without speaking, the weight of what had been acknowledged hanging between us like something fragile and precious. The drive home passed in a haze of sensation and memory. Every familiar landmark seemed altered, viewed through the lens of what had just occurred. The neighborhoods I had navigated for 18 years felt foreign, as if I were seeing them for the first time or perhaps for the last time as the person I had always been. When I reached my driveway, I sat in the car for long minutes, staring at the house where my family slept peacefully, unaware that the husband and father they knew had been fundamentally altered by a conversation and a kiss that had lasted less than an hour. The kitchen light was on, as always, but it no longer felt like a beacon guiding me home. Instead, it seemed like illumination falling on a life that belonged to someone I was no longer certain I could continue to be. I understood, with a clarity that was both devastating and liberating, that I could not step through that door and return to the performance I had been giving for decades. Whatever came next would require a different kind of courage than I had ever been asked to demonstrate. The courage to live as the person I had discovered myself to be, regardless of the cost to the world I had so carefully constructed around my previous understanding of who I was supposed to be. The collapse began gradually, then accelerated with the merciless inevitability of a structure whose foundation had been compromised beyond repair. In the days following that night at Malcolm's bar, I attempted to return to the routines that had governed my life for decades, but the performance had become impossible to sustain. Every gesture felt deliberate rather than natural. Every conversation carefully calculated to maintain the illusion that nothing fundamental had changed. Evelyn noticed first, though she approached the subject with the delicacy of someone navigating terrain that might prove unstable. Over breakfast, she mentioned that I seemed distracted lately, that I had been working unusually late, that I appeared to be listening to something she couldn't hear. Her observations were gentle but persistent, delivered with the particular attention that comes from 18 years of marriage and the ability to read subtleties that would escape casual notice. I deflected her concerns with explanations about work pressures and seasonal stress, responses that felt hollow even as I spoke them. But she was too intelligent to accept my reassurances at face value, and I could see her beginning to catalog the changes in my behavior with the systematic precision she applied to household management and child rearing. The distance between us became a tangible presence at the dinner table, during our evening walks through the neighborhood, in the bed we had shared for so many years. When she reached for my hand, I found myself tensing involuntarily. When she suggested weekend activities that had once felt pleasant and undemanding, I manufactured obligations that kept me away from family gatherings and social commitments that required sustained performance of domestic contentment. The most painful moments came when she tried to initiate the physical intimacy that had always been a reliable constant in our marriage. Her touch, once familiar and comforting, now felt like an invasion of space I needed to protect. I would lie beside her in the darkness, feeling her confusion and hurt radiating across the small distance that separated us, knowing that my withdrawal was causing pain I could neither explain nor alleviate without destroying everything we had built together. The confrontation, when it came, arrived on a Tuesday evening in late October. The children were upstairs doing homework, and we sat in the living room where family photographs lined the mantelpiece, documenting decades of shared experiences and achievements. Evelyn set down the book she had been reading and looked at me with the directness that had always been one of her most admirable qualities. "Is there someone else?" she asked, her voice calm, but carrying an undercurrent of steel that suggested she was prepared for whatever answer I might provide. The question hung in the air between us, simple and devastating in its clarity. I could not bring myself to lie to her, though neither could I offer the full truth that would have made everything clear. Instead, I found myself caught in the terrible space between honesty and deception, unable to move in either direction without causing irreparable damage. My silence lasted too long, and in that pause, she found the answer she had been seeking. Her response was quieter than I had expected, tinged with sadness rather than anger. She had suspected for weeks, she said, though she hadn't wanted to acknowledge what she was seeing. The late nights, the distraction, the way I seemed to be inhabiting our shared spaces like a guest rather than someone who belonged there. She asked if I still loved her, and when I struggled to answer, she nodded as if she had been expecting that hesitation as well. At work, the tension between Malcolm and I had begun to manifest in ways that others could sense, though they lacked the context to interpret what they were observing. Our professional interactions carried an undercurrent that had nothing to do with quarterly reports or budget projections, and I could see colleagues beginning to notice the careful way we navigated conversations, the extended meetings that seemed disproportionate to the business being discussed. The breaking point came during a routine staff meeting when a colleague made an offhand comment about Malcolm and I spending so much time together lately, joking that we had become inseparable. The remark was delivered with the casual thoughtlessness that characterizes most workplace humor, but it landed like a physical blow. I felt my face flush with a combination of panic and shame, aware that whatever we had been building in secret was beginning to cast shadows that others could detect. That evening, I drove to Malcolm's bar with a sense of urgency that bordered on desperation. I needed clarity, definition, some way to understand what was happening to me and what it would cost to pursue the truth I had discovered about myself. When I arrived, the bar was nearly empty, and Malcolm was performing the closing rituals that had become familiar to me over the past months. I demanded honesty from him, though what I was really asking for was some external authority to make the choice that felt impossible to navigate alone. I needed him to tell me what to do, to provide a framework for understanding the consequences of continuing down the path we had begun or the cost of retreating to the safety of the life I had always known. Malcolm's response carried the same steady presence that had characterized all our most important conversations. He would not make the choice for me, he said, though he understood the weight of what I was facing. "You already know who you are, Julian," he told me, his voice carrying the particular gentleness he reserved for moments of profound truth. "The question is whether you can live with it." He spoke about the nature of authenticity, the price that comes with choosing truth over security, the loneliness that accompanies any decision to live outside the boundaries that society has constructed for acceptable existence. But he also described the suffocation that results from denying essential aspects of identity, the slow death that comes from performing a role that requires the burial of everything that feels most real about who we are. Standing across from him in the amber light of his bar, I saw myself reflected in the steadiness of his gaze. He had made his own peace with solitude years ago, had chosen the difficult freedom that comes with refusing to compromise his essential nature for the comfort of conventional acceptance. He was offering me the same choice, though he was honest about the cost it would demand. The decision lay bare before me, stark in its implications. I could return to the life I had built with Evelyn and the children, accepting the suffocation that would come with continued performance of domestic contentment while burying the person I had discovered myself to be. Or I could pursue the truth that had been awakened in me, knowing that it would require the destruction of everything I had spent decades constructing around my previous understanding of who I was supposed to be. There would be no middle ground, no way to maintain both versions of myself simultaneously. The choice was absolute, demanding either the death of my authentic self or the dissolution of the world I had created around its absence. As I stood there, meeting Malcolm's patient gaze, I understood that the decision had already been made the night he first placed his hand over mine. Everything since then had been the gradual acknowledgement of what I had always known, but never been brave enough to face. The question now was whether I possessed the courage to live according to that knowledge, regardless of the cost to others and to the careful security I had built around the performance of conventional happiness. The kitchen at dawn held a quality of light that made everything appear both familiar and strange, as if I were seeing our home through a lens that revealed its essential nature for the first time. I sat at the table where we had shared thousands of meals, where homework had been completed and birthday candles blown out, where the ordinary rituals of family life had unfolded with such predictable comfort that I had stopped noticing their weight. Above me, Evelyn slept in the bed we had shared for 18 years, her breathing steady and undisturbed. The children were safe in their rooms, Emma with her soccer trophies catching the early light from her bedroom window, Michael with his band posters, and the guitar he practiced when he thought no one was listening. The house settled around us with the familiar sounds that had provided the soundtrack to decades of domestic contentment. My wedding ring rested on the table beside a sheet of paper that bore the careful handwriting I had learned in elementary school, the same script that had signed mortgage documents and report cards and birthday cards over the years that had shaped this life. The words came haltingly, scratched out and rewritten, but their meaning was clear enough to anyone who might read them. An explanation, an apology, an acknowledgement of truths that had taken me 42 years to speak aloud. I had attempted multiple drafts over the past several hours, trying to find language that would make sense of what I was doing to the people who would be most hurt by my choices. How do you explain to the woman who has loved you faithfully that you are leaving not because she failed in any way, but because you have finally discovered who you have always been beneath the performance of conventional happiness? How do you tell your children that their father is about to dismantle the only world they have ever known in pursuit of an authenticity they may never be able to understand or forgive? The letter remained unfinished, incomplete sentences that captured only fragments of what I needed to say. Some truths, I realized, resist articulation no matter how carefully we choose our words. Some decisions can only be lived rather than explained, demonstrated through actions that speak louder than any written confession could manage. Outside, Maple Street lay empty in the pre-dawn stillness. The Hendersons' perfect lawn waited for another day of careful maintenance. The corner where Sarah Chun would soon appear with her violin case remained deserted, though in a few hours it would resume its role in the choreography of suburban routine. Street lamps cast pools of yellow light that would soon be overwhelmed by sunrise, but for now they provided the only illumination in a world that felt suspended between one day and the next. I had spent the night moving through the house like a visitor, touching objects that had once defined the boundaries of my existence. The photographs that lined the hallway, documenting years of shared experiences and milestones. The grandfather clock that had marked time with such mechanical certainty, its brass pendulum catching moonlight from the front hall window. The spice rack that Evelyn organized alphabetically, the calendar on the refrigerator that tracked our lives in color-coded precision. All of it would continue without me, I realized, with a mixture of sadness and relief. The routines would adjust, adapt, find new configurations that accommodated my absence. Life had a way of healing around missing pieces, creating scar tissue that might be visible but wouldn't prevent continued function. As the first hint of sunrise began to pale the eastern sky, I stood and walked through the rooms one final time. In the living room, where we had watched countless movies and hosted dinner parties for neighbors whose names I could recite, but whose inner lives remained mysterious to me. In the kitchen, where I had made coffee every morning for 18 years, where I had sat across from Evelyn discussing schedules and budgets and the pleasant obligations of family life. Each space held memories that felt both precious and remote, as if I were viewing them through the wrong end of a telescope. This had been my life, genuinely lived and authentically experienced within the boundaries I had understood at the time. But it had also been a kind of exile, a careful construction that had required the burial of essential aspects of who I was beneath layers of respectability and conventional expectation. When I finally left the house, closing the door behind me with the soft click that had concluded thousands of ordinary days, I felt something approaching peace settle in my chest. The decision had been made not in a moment of dramatic revelation, but through the gradual accumulation of small truths that had finally reached critical mass. The drive to Malcolm's bar took me through neighborhoods that no longer felt like mine, past landmarks that belonged to the person I had been rather than the person I was becoming. The streets were empty except for the occasional early commuter, people beginning their own daily performances in jobs and relationships that might be hiding their own buried truths. Malcolm's bar sat in the morning light like a sanctuary that had been waiting patiently for my return. The gravel parking lot, the weathered sign, the small windows that revealed little of the interior. All of it appeared exactly as it had during those evening conversations that had gradually awakened me to possibilities I had never allowed myself to consider. I walked through the door without hesitation, no longer the careful, conflicted man who had spent months circling around this moment. Malcolm stood behind the bar, wiping down glasses in preparation for another day, moving with the same unhurried grace that had first caught my attention in corporate meeting rooms that now felt like locations from someone else's life. When he looked up and saw me, no words passed between us. His expression held everything: recognition, understanding, and something that looked like relief that the waiting was finally over. I had made my choice, and he had been expecting me. The silence that stretched between us felt full rather than empty, weighted with knowledge of what had been chosen and what had been sacrificed. I was no longer the married man who had stumbled into his bar, seeking something I couldn't name. I was no longer the father and husband whose life had been built around the careful maintenance of appearances that required the burial of authentic desire. I was simply Julian, finally breathing air that had been waiting for me since adolescence, finally standing in a space where pretense was unnecessary and truth could be spoken without consequence. The man who looked back at me from Malcolm's patient gaze was someone I recognized completely, someone I had always been beneath the careful construction of conventional respectability. For the first time in decades, I was home.